In the winter of 1177 BC, the greatest civilization on earth was on fire. Not one city, not one kingdom. Every major power in the eastern Mediterranean, the empires that had ruled for centuries, that had built palaces, invented writing, forged the first great trade networks in human history, collapsed within the span of a single generation. Egypt survived, but barely, and never as a superpower again. The Hittite Empire simply vanished, so completely that later civilizations forgot it had ever existed. Mycenaean Greece, the world of Agamemnon, of golden masks and lion gates, went dark and stayed dark for 400 years. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Some call it the first apocalypse in recorded history. And the strange part, we still don't fully know why it happened. Was it invaders, an army so ruthless the Egyptians simply called them the peoples of the sea? Was it climate, earthquakes, rebellion from within? Or was it something worse, a perfect storm where every single one of those disasters hit at once, and no empire, however powerful, could survive all of them together? This is the story of the world's first dark age, and it starts at the top of the world, at the height of human civilization, right before it all came crashing down. To understand how big this collapse was, you have to understand what was lost. Picture the eastern Mediterranean around 1250 BC. This isn't a scattering of isolated tribes. This is an interconnected superpower network. 5 or 6 major civilizations, bound together by trade, diplomacy, and marriage alliances, moving goods and ideas across thousands of miles of open sea. In Egypt, Ramesses the Great sits on a throne built from 1,000 years of dynastic power, commanding an empire that stretches from Nubia to the Levant. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the Hittite Empire rivals Egypt outright. These two superpowers had fought the massive Battle of Kadesh a few decades earlier, fought to a bloody standstill, and then done something remarkable. They signed the oldest peace treaty in human history still preserved today. Two empires, at the height of their power, choosing diplomacy over endless war. Meanwhile, across the sea, Mycenaean Greece is thriving. This is the world that would later inspire Homer's Tales of Troy, a network of fortress palaces filled with gold, bronze weapons, and ambitious kings, and connecting all of them, the island kingdom of Cyprus, rich in copper, the trading city of Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from a dozen nations rubbed shoulders, and the Minoans on Crete, whose art and architecture still leaves archaeologists in awe. This was globalization, 3,000 years before we invented the word. Here's an analogy worth sitting with. Imagine the modern global economy, with its shipping lanes, its supply chains, its interdependent nations, and then imagine every single one of those connections running on a single resource, a single technology, that the entire system cannot function without. For the Bronze Age world, that resource was bronze itself. And that single point of failure would matter more than anyone realized. Bronze isn't found in the ground the way iron is. You can't just dig it up. Bronze is an alloy. You have to combine copper with tin, and here's the catastrophic problem. Copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. The copper came largely from Cyprus. The tin, astonishingly, had to be shipped from as far away as modern Afghanistan, passing through a dozen hands before it ever reached a Mycenaean forge. Every sword, every plough blade, every chariot fitting in this entire world depended on a fragile, 1,000-mile supply chain that had to function perfectly, year after year, kingdom after kingdom. Think about that for a second. Modern economists have a term for this, a just-in-time supply chain. Lean, efficient, incredibly productive when everything works, and incredibly vulnerable the moment something breaks. That's not a modern invention. The Bronze Age world built the very first version of it without ever knowing the danger they were building into their own civilization. And it wasn't just the tin roots. The whole political system was interlinked too. These kingdoms wrote to each other constantly. We know this because we've found their letters, baked into clay tablets that survived the very fires that destroyed the palaces that held them. Kings called each other brother. They exchanged gifts, arranged royal marriages, sent physicians to treat each other's illnesses. It was, in almost every sense, an early version of an international system. Diplomacy, trade agreements, economic interdependence, which means when the system failed, it wasn't going to fail quietly, in one place. It was going to fail everywhere, all at once, like a row of dominoes with no gap between them. And in the final decades of the 13th century BC, the first domino started to wobble. The first warning signs weren't armies. They were letters. desperate ones. Archaeologists have recovered correspondence from this exact period, and the tone changes dramatically. Kings who once wrote about gold and marriage alliances are suddenly writing about something else entirely: grain, food, starvation. One letter, from the king of Ugarit, describes a famine so severe it reads like a plea for survival. Egyptian records describe emergency grain shipments sent to keep allied kingdoms from collapsing outright. Modern climate science backs this up in a chilling way. Analysis of pollen records, cave formations, and sediment layers from this period across the eastern Mediterranean points to a sustained mega-drought, decades long, in some reconstructions, hitting the region right as this collapse began. Imagine a drought severe enough to last not one bad harvest, not two, but potentially a generation. Entire agricultural systems, built around predictable rainfall for centuries, simply stopped producing enough food to sustain their populations. And remember, these societies were interconnected. When Egypt's harvest failed, it wasn't just an Egyptian problem, because Egypt's grain surplus was propping up allied kingdoms elsewhere. When one link in the food supply network snapped, the strain didn't disappear. It transferred to the next link, and the next. At the same time, something else was happening beneath their feet, literally. This region sits on some of the most seismically active territory on Earth, and archaeological digs across multiple Bronze Age cities show a pattern that specialists call an earthquake storm. A cluster of major quakes, striking across a relatively short window of time, toppling palace walls, collapsing ports, and disrupting the very cities that were already straining under famine. So picture it. You're a king in 1200 BC. Your harvests are failing. Your palace walls are cracking from tremors. Your trade ships aren't arriving on schedule because the ports up the coast are in ruins. And then, from the sea, something else appears. Egyptian temple walls from this era contain some of the most vivid battle scenes ever carved in stone, and they describe an enemy unlike anything the empire had fought before. The Egyptians called them simply the peoples of the sea, not one nation, not one army, a confederation, arriving in waves, made up of multiple groups with different names, different origins, sailing in distinctive ships with bird-headed prows, and attacking with a fighting style Egypt's own military reportedly borrowed from and adapted afterward. Here's what makes them so haunting to historians. We still don't fully know who they were. Theories point to displaced populations from the Aegean, from Anatolia, even from as far as Sardinia and Sicily. But the honest answer is that the written record is fragmented and biased, because almost everything we know comes from the people who were being attacked. What we do know is the pattern of destruction. City after city along the coast, Ugarit among them, was burned and never fully rebuilt. Ugarit's final king wrote a letter, discovered by archaeologists, still baked in the clay, essentially crying out for help as enemy ships appeared on the horizon. That tablet was found in a kiln, unsent. The city fell before it could ever be delivered. Here's an analogy that helps this land emotionally. Imagine a message stuck in your outbox forever, because the world ended before you could hit send. Egypt itself faced 2 massive invasions from these sea peoples, and under Ramesses III, managed to survive both. Barely. Egyptian records boast of total victory, but read between the lines and you find a nation that had been bled white by the effort. Egypt held the walls, but it never fully recovered the wealth or reach it had before. Everyone else wasn't so fortunate. But here's the crucial twist that most documentaries skip. The sea peoples probably weren't the root cause of the collapse. They were more likely a symptom of it. Refugees and raiders displaced by the exact same droughts and famines destabilizing everyone else, pushed into migration and piracy because their own homelands could no longer feed them. In other words, the apocalypse didn't come from one direction. It came from everywhere, because everyone in this interconnected world was drowning in the same crisis simultaneously. If you want to see how completely a superpower can vanish, look at the Hittites. At its height, the Hittite Empire rivaled Egypt for control of the Near East. Its capital, Hattusa, held massive fortifications, temples, and one of the largest archives of the ancient world. Thousands of clay tablets recording law, religion, and diplomacy. And then, within a matter of years, it was gone. Not conquered and absorbed, the way empires typically fall, actually gone. The capital was abandoned and burned. The royal family disappears from the historical record entirely. Trade routes that had sustained Hittite wealth for centuries collapsed overnight, likely due to the same drought and supply chain failures crippling everyone else. And here's the detail that should send a chill through you. The Hittite kingdom was so thoroughly erased that later civilizations, the Greeks, the early biblical writers, had almost no memory of it. For nearly 3,000 years, the Hittite Empire survived only as a handful of passing biblical references, until 19th-century archaeologists dug into a hillside in Turkey and rediscovered an entire lost superpower, buried under centuries of forgetting. Think about that. An empire that once negotiated as an equal with Egypt, one of the most famous civilizations in human history, came within a hair's breadth of being erased from human memory completely. If it can happen to a superpower like that, the uncomfortable question becomes, what does it take for any civilization to actually survive? By 1150 BC, the map of the ancient world had been redrawn, not by conquest, but by absence. Mycenaean Greece didn't just decline, its writing system disappeared entirely. Linear B, the script used to manage palace economies, simply stopped being used, because the palace bureaucracies that needed it no longer existed. Greece would not have a functioning writing system again for roughly 400 years. Historians call this stretch the Greek Dark Age, and it's not a dramatic name, it's a literal one. Population dropped, settlements shrank, international trade, once flourishing, nearly vanished. Across the region, monumental architecture stopped, long-distance trade stopped, literacy, in many areas, stopped. This wasn't a transition into a different kind of society. This was contraction, a hard reset on complexity itself. And this is really the heart of what makes the Bronze Age collapse so uniquely terrifying among historical disasters. It wasn't a war that one side won. There was no new empire that rose triumphantly from the ashes to rule what was lost. Nobody won the Bronze Age collapse. Everybody lost. It would take centuries before the region rebuilt anything resembling the previous era's complexity, and when it finally did, it looked completely different. Iron, not bronze, became the defining metal, in part because bronze's fragile long-distance supply chain had become simply too dangerous to depend on ever again. New peoples, new alphabets, new political structures rose from the wreckage. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age's ashes would eventually produce classical Greece, the world of philosophy and democracy we still reference today. But that world only exists because the one before it burned to the ground first. So what actually caused the Bronze Age apocalypse? For decades, historians searched for a single answer, a smoking gun. Was it the sea peoples? Was it drought? Was it earthquakes? Internal rebellion? Trade collapse? The uncomfortable, but far more accurate answer that most modern archaeologists now accept is this. It was all of it, hitting simultaneously, in a system with no slack left to absorb the shock. This idea has a name in modern disaster research: systems collapse theory. It's the same framework researchers now use to study why modern power grids fail, why financial markets crash, why ecosystems suddenly tip into collapse after years of gradual stress. It's rarely one single cause. It's multiple stresses compounding at once, each one weakening the system's ability to absorb the next. Drought weakened the harvests. Weak harvests triggered famine and displacement. Displaced populations became the sea peoples, raiding coastlines already destabilized by earthquakes. Trade routes broke under the strain of war and disaster together. And because every kingdom in this world depended on every other kingdom, the moment one part of the network failed, the entire interconnected system had nowhere left to absorb the damage. It's the same warning echoed by modern researchers studying our own interconnected, resource-dependent global systems today. Complexity and efficiency make a civilization powerful, but they can also make it fragile if too many critical systems depend on too few points of failure. The Bronze Age world built the most advanced, most interconnected civilization the ancient world had ever seen, and that interconnection is exactly what doomed it. 3,000 years later, we still walk through the ruins these people left behind: broken palace walls in Greece, silent stone corridors in Turkey, clay tablets frozen mid-sentence in a kiln in Syria. They built the first truly connected world, and when it fell together. The Bronze Age didn't end with a bang from a single enemy. It ended the way most collapses actually happen, quietly, from too many pressures, hitting all at once, until the system simply couldn't hold anymore. If you enjoyed this journey into history's first dark age, subscribe for more deep dives into the civilizations time tried to erase. And let me know in the comments, which lost empire should we resurrect?